Hello and welcome to Wands and Fronds, the weekly podcast where we cover magic, herbalism, and more. I'm Shannon,
And I'm Nick.
and we're your co-hosts. So today we're getting chatty, right? So I'm talking about plant communication, and it's going to come in two parts. First of all, how plants talk to each other, but then part two, how you, as a witch, can communicate with plants because magic. Hello. But then I'm also on like the talkative subject covering Ogma, the god of speech and language in Irish and Scottish mythology, also Ogham's namesake. And I'm like living for this episode because one of my really bad old emails back in the day was words a spoutin at hotmail.com. So made
Um,
for me in all of my Leo placements.
Shout out to Hotmail. I feel like this is like a late Gemini season episode
Yeah, it
rather
is,
th-
it is.
rather than an early Cancer season episode. Um, and that's just how I feel.
Yeah, we're just not ready to let go of Gemini season yet,
We're
and that's
really not
fine.
ready to, we're not ready to shut the fuck up about Gemini season. But so I'm talking about the magic of poetry.
Ugh,
Full stop. Which again, I'm like, yeah, this is such a Gemini episode. Like a Gemini wrote this episode.
yeah. So speaking of Geminis, oh my God, I have to like at the top talk about one of my Gemini loves, Killian Murphy. And can we talk about how terrifying his chart is? A Gemini man with an Aries moon and a
Uh
shit ton of Taurus placements. I'm like, oh my God, I'm scared of him and horny.
yeah,
What's
I'm
happening?
soaking wet. I'm soaking wet for Cillian Murphy's chart.
But also his like soft boy Saturn and Cancer.
Oh yeah. Okay, so that you know what, we're gonna talk about this in my segment. But before we really get in to this very like Gemini themed episode, when did you feel the magic this week?
Oh my God. So I texted Nick about this yesterday. Actually, I made some sun tea because we've been talking about making sun tea with all the like solar energies in the
Oh yeah.
air. And I made a sun tea that was lemon balm, pineapple sage, and just like a couple of chamomile flowers, like all of this from my garden, like fresh cut yesterday morning, covered them all in water, put them out in the sun. And oh my God, it was so good. Like,
That and I that did sound incredible, and I was jealous.
well, we'll make some when you're here in August.
Oh, and yes, I am so excited. It's literally like a month away because I'm not counting the end of this month because it's 4 days away,
It's done. This month is done.
and I'm not counting the like 4 days in August
Because why would you?
because why would you? So really, it's 1 month away. It's exactly 1 month away.
Exactly. Nick, what about you? When did you feel magical this week?
So I felt magical this week. It was actually okay. So I have had quite a week. For some personal reasons that I'm not going to get into, but I also like really fucked up my back.
Oh,
Um,
welcome to your
uh,
30s, children that are listening to this.
yeah, I know, like literal children that are listening. Yeah, your 30s love injuring my back in my sleep.
Oh my God, I tweaked my upper back in my sleep last night.
So love it, love it, love it. I mean, to everyone that's watching on Patreon, you can see that my neck is so stiff, it's a little crooked. My neck's a little
Oof.
crooked. Um, so that's cool. But once I got over that though, okay, but I was kind of like laid up, right? So like I was not in a lot of pain. Like once I got the knot out, I was just kind of resting. You know, we're having like a
Yeah.
moment of we're just resting. But I knew I had poetry as a topic this week. So all week long, I have just been like kind of reading poetry. Like I reread God I Feel Modern Tonight. Which is now signed. I know it's now a signed copy because
Woo.
um and I've also just been reading like all of those like old school poems that they made you read. Shout out to stop stopping by the woods on a snowy evening.
Oh my God, yes. Nick and I were texting about this, and I was like, as a choir kid, poetry, like, is very much a part of the choral tradition, and the number of choral arrangements I have been like, that I have sang of stopping by the woods on a snowy evening, like, I cannot exaggerate. So many, and I love them all.
Yes. So, gosh, what is today? Sunday? So Friday night, I got cut early from work because it's summer season, it's kind of slow, and I was laid up on my couch like hedonism bot, okay, reading poetry and drinking fucking a Chambord spritzer. And I was like, "Oh my god, I am a goddess right now." Like,
Yeah. You're like,
uh,
It's fine, I'm all powerful, NBD."
but no, just like just like a lot, like literally like lounging on the couch, reading poetry, like drinking wine and like black raspberry liqueur. I
It's
really,
perfect.
it was Dionysian, it was Venusian,
All things good.
it was everything, it was everything.
I love that. Well, I think before we get too much into the topic, obviously we have to address the elephant in the room, Roe v. Wade being overturned.
Yeah, that was a time when I did not feel magical this week.
No. And I mean, there's so much good like community organizing that's going on, but I think especially as witches, first of all, like this is the time for baneful magic. I really think so. If you are someone that has a practice that includes things like hexing, go for it.
Oh yeah.
'Tis the season. But
Oh yeah.
also, many of you probably know, if you've listened to this podcast at all, that I now live in California, and there's what they call the West Coast Offensive. And so this offer just like stands for any listeners. If you have family or friends that need help, that need a place to stay in California, to come for abortion care, like I'm not joking. Email us and I will give you my personal cell phone number. Get in touch. I have a guest room. I live in LA. There are plenty of like abortion providers around. If you need mail ordered abortion medication and you're scared to get it sent to you because you live in an insane state or you live with people that you can't trust, email us. I'll give you my personal cell. You can send it to me here in LA. I'll put it in a fucking bag of jelly beans and mail it to you with like a card or some shit. Like, just please know that you are very, very supported here as much as possible. But also, don't donate to Planned Parenthood right now. Like, Planned Parenthood doesn't need your money. Go straight to abortion funds. That's just like, as a professional fundraiser, I also think that's really important to add. Also, don't fucking donate to Democrat, like, fucking politicians who have had so long to codify Roe v. Wade and haven't done it and haven't protected your voting rights. Fuck them. They
I
don't
was
like, fuck
No,
that.
because I literally was like, why are y'all in my DMs right now? Like trying to
Yeah.
get money. Like
Like, excuse me? And vote blue no matter who. With what fucking voting rights, bitches? Like, I'm sorry.
it's like
No.
we already gave y'all money and y'all won the elections that you said you needed to win and
You've still done nothing.
still
And
done nothing.
it's I feel like it's just so much one of those instances where it's like we can't rely on the system that broke everything to fix it. And like, yes, protesting is important, and yes, like civil unrest is super necessary. But I think this is a very important time to turn to community care and like taking care of each other. So that's just like my 2 cents. I like to think I have some leg to stand on to talk about this because number one, I've had an abortion in Texas, like full disclosure, I got an abortion in Texas in the year of our Lord 2015. I had to go to the clinic twice because I had to go, and then they made me listen to this like weird fetal monitor where it like sounds like a hummingbird, and they're like, that's your fetus's heartbeat. And then I went back the next day to get an abortion. And luckily, the abortion provider I saw in Austin was very comforting. You know, he had to read the shit that Texas requires, where it's like abortion carries all these risks, but luckily he added all of his own amendments, like, but not nearly as many as pregnancy. Um, but just as someone who's been through that and understands that, like, I think this idea that abortion is something that's like an impossible decision and very emotionally traumatizing. It's like, no, fuck that. Like, it's healthcare. I feel so grateful that I was able to get an abortion, but even 7 years ago, back when it was less regulated than it is going to be now, like, it was so hard. I had to take extra time off work. I had to come up with money because none of it was covered by insurance. So it's like I've been there, and so I know what it's like to be in the position where you need to make that choice and it sucks, and, like, even if you feel really good about it, the process of doing it is awful. So, like, just know that, like, I'm here for you. Anyone that has a womb that needs abortion care, like, please just if there's anything I can do, like, please email me. Like, this isn't just, like, some I'm not saying this to placate people, like, I genuinely am here to help if anyone needs it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm here in Texas, so not much in I no one's coming to Texas, but you know what I think of, and just to kind of throw my dumb 2 cents in here, but it's like I just think of all the girls that like we grew up with, like the girls from places like Granbury that really would probably have done stupid shit if they did not have access to even get reproductive care in secret,
Yeah.
like, because
Yeah.
that's ultimately going to be the cost of this decision is like a lot of innocent people are going to resort to some very hacky shit to try to like deal with these issues at home, and that's heartbreaking, and ultimately like people are going to die, people are going to
Yeah.
die from doing shit like that, and that's
Also, no more fucking Republicans. Not at all. If someone in your life that you have had sex with ever is a Republican, holds right-wing pro-life, quote unquote views, don't let them get in anymore. No one gets to stick it in if they're not pro-choice. So,
yeah, I mean really it's like I think a lot. Also, I mean, on a lighter note, but like not a lighter note, I did see this tweet that was like a lot of dudes are about to find out that they are not worth it.
yeah. Yeah, and honestly, fucking good. But I felt like we needed to talk about it up top, but this isn't like a political podcast, so we don't wanna spend the entire time talking about it, not because we don't care, but because I think we assume, like we do, you might need a bit of a reprieve to think
Yeah,
about something
yeah,
else
so
for a
so
minute.
we're not gonna talk about it for like a whole like 45 minutes.
Yeah, because we all need a break. We all need a break from doom scrolling because, if you don't take care of your mental health, you can't continue to show up in important ways. So, I wanted to talk about plant communication, guys. It's something I think, number one, is a fascinating thing in nature, but also it's super important for anyone who works with plants magically. And I am like, I self identify as a green witch, like plant magic is super important to my practice in so many ways as an herbalist, as a magical human, as a creature that inhabits this planet with plant life. And I think understanding the historical associations of various plants can be super helpful when you're trying to do spells, of course. Like we love Cunningham's encyclopedia. We love getting on the internet and finding like which deities things have historically been associated with. But nothing trumps your own intuition, right? Like your relationship with your plant allies is always going to be stronger than something you read in a book. So, first, I want to talk about the cool ways though that plants talk to each other. And then I'm going to get into like my personal method for getting to know plant spirits and give you like a few ideas on how to get started, like cozying up to the plants in your life. But my very favorite, super nerdy science plant topic is mycorrhizal networks. Okay. And this is a perfect example of the magic that takes place like under our noses and literally under our feet constantly in nature. This idea that humans are the pinnacle of evolution is a fucking joke. Like, there's so much intelligence in the natural world. So, plants and fungi actually communicate with other plants and fungi using what are called mycorrhizal networks. But the coolest part here is that the communication isn't limited to like same species conversations. They can literally communicate across species using the system, which is like bonkers. Like, how many species do humans actually communicate with? You
I mean,
know,
and truly, are we really communicating with our pets? I do not think my cats understand uh, most of what's going on.
no, no. And the cool thing about these like fungal networks is they're context dependent, right? So they can be affected by a lot of factors, including like soil fertility, and they can even change based on the season. But the most basic way to describe what it is that mycorrhizal networks are underground hyphal networks created by mycorrhizal fungi. And they connect individual plants together, and through them, they transfer water, carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients and minerals. And these are so complex. These mycorrhizal, you can think about mycorrhiza as like basically strings of fungus, right? That kind of connect things. And these networks are so complex and they play a very important role in woodlands. So of course, like they got a cheesy nickname called the Wood Wide Web,
Oh,
which
of course, of course.
a dad came up with
I
that.
was gonna say some research guy in a plaid shirt came up with that.
Right, and he laughed and patted himself on the back. But the resource transfer here is thought to be driven by what's called a source sink model, right? So plants that are in areas with like a lot of resource availability will transfer carbon or nutrients to plants located in less favorable places. So like the most common one we see is like forest canopy plants and trees transferring carbon to plants that are in the shaded understory because those plants aren't able to photosynthesize as easily. So there's this amazing scientist, of course it's a woman, Susan Simard, who did a lot of study on these networks in the wild by analyzing the DNA and root tips and tracing the movement of molecules through underground conduits. And when Susan started doing this when Suzanne started doing this research, all these male scientists were like, "Oh, this is girly bullshit. This is woo woo. What the fuck are you talking about?" And now she's like considered one of the like leading experts on this. But in her studies, she found that the fungal threads in the soil link nearly every tree in a forest, including like all species. And the resources tend to flow from like the oldest and largest trees to the youngest and smallest. Again, thinking about that resource sink. And if a seedling is like seared from the network, it's actually more likely to die or have stunted growth than one in the network. And it's like, wow, it's almost like humans and how when people get cut off from community, they tend to wither on the vine. But anyway, I also love that sometimes they found that if a tree is on the brink of death, it'll actually like give its carbon to neighboring trees too. It's like, okay, look, I'm on the way out. You guys take these resources. Boomers, pay fucking attention. So they can also use hormones though to sound an alarm. For example, if there's like a pest infestation, the first affected plants can actually warn others in their network who then might undergo something like a chemical change to make their flavor less appealing. And there have even been studies that show that roots move towards water sources, right? Which feels so logical until you like take one step and you're like, wait, but how the fuck would plants know where water sources are? Communication networks. There are even certain like flowering plants that can sweeten their nectar when bees are near. Like it's amazing. And these networks aren't forest specific either. Like there are studies showing more and more examples of these basically anywhere plant life exists, including deserts. Desert plants communicate to each other. So this is like a very brief overview of mycorrhizal networks, but I just am fascinated by these. Like the fact that plants are talking to each other, sharing resources. It's like, who knew? And of course, it was like a woman scientist who started thinking about this, and everyone poo-pooed her. And now she's right.
And she was right, and ultimately, good for her.
Hundo P. So, but as witches, right? How do we talk back to plants? So I'm going kind of off resource here, talking about my personal experience and suggestions. So, like, take what you like, take what works, leave the rest. But I think one of the primary things I would suggest everyone do first is like get to know your local flora. One of the like pitfalls I think of relying so much on historical resources as witches is, especially for those of us that come from like Celtic backgrounds, a lot of the plants that have so much history aren't necessarily native, right? Like these aren't always plants that are growing wild near us. So even if you live in a city, there are plants, I promise you. Take a nature walk, walk somewhere where there is as much nature as possible. Even just a park is okay, but like walking down the sidewalk, plants will grow up through the cracks in the sidewalk. Like there are plants near you. So go on a walk, get out and get outside, get out in nature or nature adjacent stuff. No headphones, no distractions. Just walk and notice. Then you want to do this a few times and like try to take in the plants around you, but don't go looking things up yet. Don't like try to figure out the exact species if you don't already know. That's okay. Like this is just about like noticing, right? Just taking things in, trying to absorb it. And then once you're familiar with your area, take a bit more time, look through the specific plants and like see if one calls to you, right? What's a plant that maybe you notice all the time? Do you like constantly find yourself aware of like dandelions coming up through the cracks? Is there a sycamore tree that like fills you with awe? And when you found that first plant that you want to get to know, like any relationship, you want to like spend time with it. You need to get familiar with the energy. And so I kind of talked about it last week, but for me, I think just an easy example is there's a sycamore outside my front door that has always felt special to me. Like ever since we moved in, I was like, "Oh my god, I love this tree." Like I'm so drawn to this tree. So one of the ways I started getting to know it is I would just like sit with it. I would sit next to the tree, I would lean against the tree, I'd touch the tree anytime I go outside. And that's all you have to do at first, right? Is just like get to know it. Sit in silence, ask the plant for permission to begin a relationship, and how does it feel, right? Like, does the energy have a color? Are you feeling like a specific emotion that comes to mind? Do you feel the energy in maybe like a specific part in your body? There aren't wrong answers here. Like, let it speak to you. And the way that you practice the craft is probably going to influence how you're experiencing the energy. So, like, as an herbalist, often I'll find when I'm getting to know plants, I'll like feel it in specific parts of my body. And I think it's just because, like, as an herbalist, as someone who works with plants medicinally and magically, so much of the way that I think about plants is like where they're touching our bodies, right? Like where that relationship is. But if you're not like, if that's not the type of craft you practice, it might feel different to you. And that's okay, right? Like you have to find your own way here. This is about you, your intuition. But when you've had your meditation time and you're ready to leave, thank the plant. And if you're able to, I think a small offering is always nice. So for me, one of the things I do with my sycamore is like I'll leave flowers and herbs at the base of the tree. Like there's always a little pile of like drying herbs and stuff. But also, if I do rituals like around the Sabbats where we leave out offerings, things like libations, honey, and milk, those also go out to the tree. And if it's a shorter lived plant, of course, you're not going to be able to like go back to the same exact plant time and time again. But you can do this one or two times and like get to know the species. I often find that dandelions in an area feel very similar to each other, right? So it's like feel it out. And then if it's an herb or a plant that you want to use magically, you want to try to begin like to feel the associations that are calling to you, right? I think before you look it up, always just try to like use your intuition. ask the plant like what its strengths are, what it's good for. Like I think good for sounds actually a little dismissive. It's like what are the plant strengths? What kind of magic does this plant excel at? Like how can it help further magical work? So it's like do you work with planetary magic? Okay, like what planet does it feel like? Does this feel like a Martian vibe? Does it feel lunar? If you're someone who works with deities, like, is there a specific deity that this feels related to? And then if you'd like to take a piece of the plant for a spell to use, magically or to make medicine, I think you should always ask for permission too, right? Like, you might not get a yes right away, and you have to be ready to accept a no, which sometimes that's the answer. But when you do get a yes, like be respectful, only harvest what you need. Definitely make an offering if you're taking pieces away. Like a good rule of thumb for harvesting is you should never take more than a third of the plant material at one time, because if you do, you could actually kill the plant. Of course, one of the things that I like to do, like with my tree while I'm working on this wand, once my wand is finished, I'm going to take it and show it to the tree. You know, I think that's something else is like show it what you're doing because these are living creatures. They can communicate to each other. Why would we think they can't communicate with us? You can do this with dried plant matter too. Personally, I have a harder time getting to know the energy of plants that are no longer living, but there is still energy there for sure. And if you're someone who doesn't necessarily work with live plants often, you might have an easier time reading the energy of like dried plant matter. For me, it's difficult, but I think it's just because like I'm a gardener. I spend a lot of time with like house plants. That's just not the way that my magic works. But on that note, you don't have to exclusively do this with like nature plants either. I work with my house plants magically. They sit on my altar. And just because I'm not planning to like eat them or use a part of the plant in the spell doesn't mean you can't ask for the plant's energy to support your magic, right? Like I have some really great so Nadia, my, Monstera, she's like the mini Monstera adansonii. Like, she is so great for abundance work, and I just know that from, like, becoming familiar with her. I love her. I also share cuttings of her with friends, which is another way to do magic with, like, your houseplants, but I'm never gonna eat her. She's poisonous. Like, I'm not gonna do that, but that doesn't mean that if I'm doing abundance work, I don't, like, ask for her to provide a little bit of aid. But you can still make offerings to them, right? Like water them with moon water when you can. Source like good fertilizer. I like to use things like worm castings, fish emulsion, kelp, things that are natural. They're not, it's not prohibitively expensive to source something like I have a fish emulsion and kelp fertilizer that was probably about the same price as a thing of Miracle Grow. So it's like this isn't prohibitively expensive and you can get it online. But yeah, you'll find that your houseplants have different personalities. And to me, even within like a species, and I think this is true of all plants, but with houseplants, because of the nature of them, it's like even within species, sometimes they can have slightly different energies. And so just get to know them. And that's where the fun of like plant magic comes in for me, right? Like I love getting to know my plants. I learn the Latin names, how to take care of them, all the basics. But like as a magical person, you get this whole other layer of experience with plants that is so fun. But also, I think it's like an honor, right? Like it's magical, but it's an honor to get to know plants and get to work with them and like have the ability to cohabitate with these like amazing beings. And I think this type of work is like a muscle, right? Like the more you work it, the easier it becomes. And you might also start finding that like certain plants call out to you a lot more when you get into this work. So like for example, last summer I could not avoid dandelion. Like I would always see them, I would always hear from them, and they can be asking for attention and offerings, but I've found too that sometimes, especially if plants are also medicinal, they can be offering you aid. So, like, I have IBS and was quitting drinking last year. So, like, it makes sense that I'd be hearing loud and clear from something that's like so good for digestion and like liver cleansing. So, I'm going to call it here for now, but in a couple of months, I do have an episode planned where I'm going to talk about finding a plant familiar. So stay tuned for that. But I did use a few sources for the mycorrhizae section, of course, Wikipedia. And there's a really great New York Times article called The Social Life of Forests that I would suggest checking out. So, plants.
Love that. Love that. I feel like we're kind of getting back to our roots a little bit with this episode.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I do love that, truly. And kind of like speaking of getting back to your roots, I'm talking about poetry this week. So I was actually really excited. Again, I feel like this is like the hangover of Gemini season, but I do just want to share up top though that I have loved both reading and writing poetry for most of my life. Um, so Shannon, and you don't have to say whether you think it's good or not, but I think just confirm for everyone, the listeners, that I do in fact keep up with this practice, as evidenced by the fact that I send you my notes app poetry at 3 in the morning.
Yeah, no, it's first of all, it is great. I think Nick's a very talented writer, but all the time. I really enjoy when I wake up and I see that I have like 6 messages from Nick. I'm like, "Oh, Nick was writing last night." And it's
Yeah, yeah.
great. It's like I think it's such a special thing and I'm also very honored that you share it with me, but
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
oh
I
yeah.
mean, yeah, literally my notes app is just full of poems. And yeah, as a kid, loved, love poetry. Um, and Shannon, you remember my typewriter collection?
I do.
Nothing in this world that I love more than fucking around with the formatting of a poem with a typewriter. Good God, what a rush.
Yeah.
What an
And
absolute rush.
you're in good company. Tom Hanks also collects typewriters. Fun facts.
I did know that. I did know that because I think that is that's neat. That's neat is the right word. Neat
Yeah.
is
He actually loaned a lot of his collection for an exhibition at the LA Public Library a few years ago. That was cool. But yeah, for our listeners, Tom Hanks has a delightful collection of typewriters.
um and but I think also like before I really and truly dive in, I want to talk about something which has sort of happened in the poetry world that I am decidedly not okay with, which is sort of like the large scale relegation of the poetic arts to these sort of stuffy corners of academia. And like truly, given the history of the art form, I feel like it goes against the spirit of the thing itself. Uh I feel like poetry is for the people. I because it's like so much good poetry is like wrapped up in like social changes, like religious upheaval, like poetry is there. Like poetry changes the world or it documents the world in a way that is almost more complete than just a cut and dry factual
Yeah,
account
because
of
like
something.
poetry can get at the things that aren't tangible, evidence-based things. It's like the emotion, the ethos. Like you're not gonna get that in just like a straight cut and dry documentary.
Yeah, and and it's like the fact that you can capture so much emotional content. It's like, it's like I like poetry where it's like you're describing a linoleum floor, but it's actually a poem about your mom dying. And
Yeah.
for some reason you're like crying at the end. Um
Oh, yeah. We went to, so just a bit of a segue here for just a quick second. Last week on Wednesday, Eric and I went to this show. There's this great artist, this non-binary artist, Alok, who does these shows that are like part poetry reading, part stand-up. And like, I was weeping by the end of one of them. It's like poetry is so powerful.
And that's really, I think, the meat of what I wanted to talk about today, because poetry really is like words are so powerful, and then poetry is literally words that you have put the time and effort and like arranging them in an artistic way, uh which makes it even more powerful, and it's one of those things where it's like you remember poetry. Like,
Yeah.
I could tell you a story, and okay, so but it's like, what is poetry? Okay, and this is one of those things that is so tricky to define. Lots of varying opinions going literally all the way back to antiquity. One of the very first things people debated about is about like, what is poetry? Like, um but basically it is language that has been given structure beyond its most basic form. So I could tell you a story. I could be like, I went to the store, and that would be like prose, right? Like, I went to the store, I bought bread and milk and eggs, right? And but if we were to season that with some structure, maybe some repeating lines, maybe some alliteration, maybe some rhyming, okay, maybe. But if we're like writing that too with like the spoken rhythm and like the cadence of whoever's speaking in mind, we kind of create this thing which is called poetry. Okay, and that's okay. It's like one of the very first things that people ever fucking argued about for hours on end was, what is a poem? And a play can be written in poetry, but it is still a play, right? But the individual pieces are poems.
Yeah, I feel like to me, poetry, it's almost like the whole thing with like pornography, right? Where it's like, I can't necessarily define it, but I know it when I see it.
Yeah, exactly. Because like a good tweet can be a poem, you know.
Yeah. Nick has tweeted some poetry, y'all.
I absolutely do tweet cryptic things, and that poetry. It's poetry.
Yeah, it's poetry.
Um okay, so it's like, here's an example. Here's an example of, is this a poem? Which is a tweet that I did where I said, saying that you've been proposed to twice is a really lame way of saying you're single. Um and that was that is that a poem? I don't know.
I think so.
I think so. But really, but so poems do not have to rhyme, but they have to have like a structure. Like, the difference between a poem and a paragraph is truly the structure. So it is kind of about how you write it. And there is this thing too when you're writing and reading poetry where it's literally like a space can do so much.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I don't know, and it's like when you're writing poetry, and it's like that very, like, Shel Silverstein thing where it's like the structure of the poem has to do with the content of the poem as well, or I speaking of which, shout out to Shel Silverstein.
I wept when Shel Silverstein died when we were in 2nd grade. Like, I cried
Yeah,
hard. It was, like, one
yeah.
of the first, like, quote, unquote, "celebrity deaths" that actually I remember rocking my fucking world. Like, I was heartbroken.
Oh, truly, 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 truly. And it's just like, but, it's great example, okay, like the fucking Giving Tree.
Oh my god.
Break my fucking heart. Like, this is why we are who we are. This is why we
Yeah.
are who we are. Because it's like, it literally shapes your mind. Like, poetry is used so much. Okay, and that's kind of the thing too, where it's like, because of it's like this weird thing with memorization, like so much of how what they teach you is all like little rhyming bullshit, right? Um, and then you remember it forever.
Yeah.
And somehow that works. Okay. But it's also like songs. Like, we do have to talk about music because lyrics are poetry. Lyr
Oh, yeah.
um, but okay, the idea of poetry is almost as old as language itself, because we talk about the structure of it as though we're writing it down, but truly we're talking about the structure of it, the way that you speak it, the way you space it out, like putting emphasis on certain words and not putting emphasis on other words. And also colloquialisms, hello, like, but the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is also kind of like widely regarded as the first piece of literature, sort of like a long form story format, okay, is written over 5,000 years ago. That is 50 centuries, if you're
Oh,
keeping track.
God. So many
Uh,
centuries.
that's a lot of centuries, okay? But it's based on an even older oral tradition. And guess what? It's written in verse, okay? And it's one of those things where it was written down at different times by different people, but you can see the original. And so that's kind of like how they know which parts of it are like the original parts and sort of like which parts are the add-on parts, because the original parts have this same structure, this same cadence. And so some of the added on parts try to recreate it, but not faithfully. And so it's like you can kind of date which parts of the Epic of Gilgamesh were like added on at which times, because the writing's different. Poetry is so powerful because it is, to me, like the form of writing that can best convey voice. I think prose is great, but like as a form of art, I think with the thing with poetry is that you could say one word and it like as like the reader, like you understand what they mean because of you know whereas with like a book you really have to spell it out for people. um so it's like almost open to interpretation. It's crazy. It's absolutely, but it's voice. It's absolutely voice. And like people with strong voices write the best poetry.
Oh,
Um
yeah. Yeah.
because it's like truly, 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 like when you read Edgar Allan Poe, like you can hear this like sad Baltimore guy just sort of like, half cocked on laudanum syrup, like
Yeah. Can we also just like take a beat to thank Baltimore for some greats? Edgar Allan Poe, John Waters.
yeah,
Like,
Baltimore.
okay, Baltimore.
Okay, Baltimore. Like who knew? Um, okay, but we're coming in strong with the Mesopotamian connection because, of course, like Mesopotamia is arguably the oldest culture in the world, but they had poetry. But like, there is, if you look even in like a pre-Mesopotamian way, there is sufficient evidence that poetry goes all the way back with language, and it's like here's why it's important, because this is a way to maintain cultural memories. And if we think about the Druids in a very different part of the world, but like these animistic religions, like in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Himalayas, like what would go on to be like the Indus Valley civilization, in China, like along the Yangtze, like there's sufficient evidence that people were doing poetry even before they like lived in houses. Like these people were sitting around a fire. And if we look at like the surviving animistic religions, like what you would maybe want to call like a tribal religion, what have you, like an indigenous sort of spirituality, it's a lot of chanting. It's a lot of chanting. It's a lot of percussion. It's a lot of things that like really lend themselves to being a kind of poetry. But also, it's like with these stories, with these oral histories, like making them with these mythologies, even like making them into poetry just makes them like that much easier to remember and then retell.
Yeah,
Um,
it's like very convenient for people that aren't necessarily writing things down.
right, right, right. And again, the fuck the Druids for never writing anything down. Like I would love, I would love to be able to read some like druids poetry the way I can read Sappho, which
Right.
we're jumping ahead a little bit, but like I did read a bunch of Sappho poems this week because I'm really just like a lesbian at heart. And
Yeah, you were definitely a lesbian in a past life.
I definitely was a lesbian in the past life. Thank you for noticing. And but no, I was like reading Sappho's poetry, and it's truly like that lady really loves her friends.
I do love, isn't it? And God, was it Sylvia Plath? There was some poet that like historians are like, you know, when her good friend would send her letters, and it was like in one of her letters, she was like, I lick the envelope seal in case I can still taste you. And they're just like, they were friends.
They
It's
were
like,
they were friends. Well, no, it's very much like Emily Dickinson, like lived with her best friend and shared a bed with her, and
yeah, it's like, I adore you, Nick. I have never once licked anything you sent me because we're actually friends.
we're actually friends. No, and it's like I'm not writing epic length poetry about the power of our friendship.
No, because it's great, but like, we're not fucking. Like, that's
But okay, but the connection with poetry and spirituality though, it does go all the way back. Because again, chanting is a form of poetry. Sorry, I did not make that rule. Okay, that's just something that people think is true, is that chanting is kind of poetry. And but going back to like more of like a brick and mortar civilization, like Mesopotamians had hymnals. So like the king of Sumeria would sing this like hymn to the goddesses, which was like this love poem. Um, again, lyrics are poetry. Sorry, that's I did not come up with those rules. That's just a thing. Um, but so he would like sing this love poem to the goddesses in this like yearly ritual. And then also like they had hymns in Egypt. They had like proper hymns, like a hymnal. So you would have like different songs for different gods, different temples, whatever, but they had like a sort of an official Egyptian hymnal, which is lovely. And that idea kind of carries over into Hebrew culture and Greek culture. So the Hebrews, obviously, people in America who were raised Christian will be familiar with Psalms, or people who were raised Jewish. I'm so sorry because that is your book. That's y'all's book too.
yeah, I mean, also Muslim.
Yeah, well, but I don't think the Psalms, like the Torah is not part of the Muslim tradition, though.
No, but they have
They
psalms.
do,
So
they
it's
do,
like they're all
they do.
Abrahamic. They all come from the same roots. So yeah,
They
it's
have,
like
but I'm just saying, like the Psalms, they have their own version of that. But I'm saying, like
the
literally,
Torah hundo p the same. Also, like talking about the Old Testament, man, there's like, which psalm is it? There's a psalm that talks about bashing babies' heads against rocks,
yeah.
which
There's a lot of fucked up shit in the Bible. Um, but they did a lot of the Bible is written in verse, like a versic structure.
yeah, like Genesis is
Uh-huh.
a poem.
It's a poem. And there's a reason for that because again, it's easier to remember these things as you're like telling them around the fire, which is like very important to people back in the day. They would tell stories around the fire, and it's like if you're telling the story of how God created the world, that's one you want to remember. It's an important story. So yeah, it's a poem. The Bible is basically a book of poetry. Um, and the Quran is definitely a book of poetry. Like, which actually I think some of the poetry in the Quran is very beautiful. Like, I don't find it spiritually moving, but I think it's very beautifully written. And so, um, I think sort of this like ceremonial practice though of reciting poetry is going to be like our bridge to modern witchcraft though. Um, and again, we really can trace it all the way back. Uh, and I think Greece though is a good place to stop off because A, they did have a whole muse of poetry. Like they really, really, really were into the poetic arts. So we have Calliope, who is the chief of the muses, being also the muse of heroic poetry. But also, like, if we're talking about important poetry, the Odyssey and the Iliad um, are epic length poems. Like, they're not just stories, like, they were literally written as poetic verses. And they were meant to be like performed and read out loud. Um, but also like shout out to the Aeneid for being like the Roman equivalent of the Odyssey. Um, but also like ancient Greece, right? So like is really a time and place that we start to get like whole plays written in verse. And so these were often about or in honor of the various gods and goddesses. And I think this is good news for Westerners because ultimately, this idea of doing like plays in verse kind of leads ultimately into Shakespeare and like that great tradition of like English language drama largely being presented in verse for a very long time. Um, and that's, I mean, some of the best poetry that we have comes from Shakespearean plays. And like all of those really great soliloquies written in verse are beautiful poems in and of themselves.
Yeah.
And this is coming from a guy who also just wrote beautiful poetry. Like, but the fact that like even just these plays are also just like beautiful poems. Like I think it was a great cultural phenomenon again to kind of come out of ancient Greece, and so we thank them for that, for kind of making that leap from it being this sort of like art form that was kind of mostly reserved for like sacred things, hymnal, like music was a religious thing, and like
Oh yeah.
verse was a religious thing, and then you kind of start doing these plays at these festivals, and then you kind of get into this like heroic poetry, which is kind of purely for entertainment and really opens up kind of the Western world to like romance poetry, which I personally love. I love the romantic era of poetry. Like I love a good sonnet, like it's just it is what it is. But so kind of again, we wanted to talk about this bridge between like sort of like a Greek hymn, a Greek hymnal to like modern witchcraft, right? So obviously we have the Celts. The Celts loved poetry. The Celts loved, like the Druids would love to carry around a little harp and recite poetry. And they didn't write any of it fucking down, so we don't really know what it was all about. But we can assume that it was a lot about trees and probably a lot of history. I'm sure there's a lot of great poetry that we're never going to hear about the Tuatha De Danann, and all of those wacky Celtic characters. But we cannot talk about like kind of bridging this gap between the sort of ancient world and like modern paganism without talking a little bit about the Poetic Eddas, which is how so much of the history of Norse paganism was preserved in this poetic form, um, which is great. But also it's like the Norse people were fucking around with poetry as a way to like remember these very important cultural stories. And I think that's kind of where we can kind of look at as modern witches is like, so the Wiccan Rede, the Wicked, I mean, and I'm not going to recite the Wiccan Rede. It is the Wiccan Rede. Oh my god, W and R should not be that close together. but it's like sort of this very long poem that's sort of about like the fundamental tenets of Wicca, um, which I thought was lovely. Like I thought it was well written, like and it's like but when you're reading it, it does seem so much more powerful because it is written in verse. Like you could write a manifesto about what the general tenets of Wicca are. And that would kind of, I don't want to say go in one ear and out the other because I'm interested in it, right? But like the fact that it's a poem, the fact that these verses literally just kind of like stick in your head instantly. The just this like mere amount of structure like does help you remember. And I think, it's like that's
I
what's it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's also what makes it powerful, like what makes poetry in particular powerful for magic. Because if you're like reciting spells, you don't want to be
Yes.
reading from a book when you're doing your
No.
magic. You're not able to actually channel your energy. So it's like even just the practical side of it making it easier for you to memorize things. There's so much
Exactly.
power
It's
in that.
there's so much power in that. And then also, it's like because there's so much symbolism involved in doing ceremonial witchcraft. I do think poetry is like a natural part of that because it's like
Yeah.
really like when you're writing, it's just like when you're writing poetry, and this is kind of where I'm going off onto like my own tangent because like as someone who's writing, it's like there is and I'm someone who does not meditate, and I literally just say that I have fucking ADD like nobody's fucking business. Okay, like legit reasons that meditation does not work for everyone. I'm sorry. It's just like one of those things where it's like I understand that it is a good practice. And I certainly try to incorporate elements of like a good meditation practice into my own practice. But as far as just like sitting there and truly not thinking or like being in this kind of flow state, it's hard for me to get there. But when I'm like writing poetry, it is a flow state for me. It's absolutely like open up the channel and just like let whatever comes through out.
Yeah.
And I would say it's like even just like the act of writing poetry is magic. Again, I don't know how I do not know how else to describe it, but there is this like connection. It to me it's spiritual, but it is but I mean like even just like take it out of context of like spirituality, like it is this flow state. Like there is just like this channel that opens up and like stuff comes through. And I think even if you're not intending to share it, like getting into that state and just like fucking around with writing some poetry is going to be incredible for anyone who is a practicing witch. Like, but also I would say kind of easing it into your craft. Like, we do so many homebrews here at Once and Franz, and it's like if you can write a verse of your own magical poetry to do as your incantation. I say, I believe that that is more powerful than if you were to just buy a book or go do some research online and like take something that someone else has written, that someone else has done, and just do that. And I would say that's fine. That's absolutely fine. If you are not taken by the creative spirit and doing like engaging that is not your thing, still be a witch, buy a book, do spells from a book. That's, I'm not saying that's bad, but I'm personally saying I believe that there is more power in it when you are kind of crafting these things yourself, when you are coming up with your own incantations, and you are also like calling upon the deities that you want to call upon, like, you know, and like it's custom. It's so much more custom, and I just think there's something to that. I absolutely think there's something to that. And I also think though, I mean, it's like on the side of just like emotionally processing. So when I first started writing poetry, it was actually at the recommendation of my therapist that I went to as a kid, because I had to do this like court ordered like family therapy kind of thing when my parents got divorced. It was really messy, and I was really young, and I had to go see this therapist. But like one of the way, 'cause I was dealing with a lot of like emotional turmoil, um, and one of the ways that they had me deal with that was by writing poetry. And it really just stuck as like kind of my main exercise in journaling too. Like I don't journal, I just write poetry. And I'm gonna be honest with you guys, sometimes I will just write poetry and burn it because I'm like, I don't think it's good, or like I can't get it just right. Or like it sometimes it's just not even meant to like share. Sometimes poetry is just not meant to share. But the the sort of cathartic feeling of like writing something out, fucking around with I would say it's magic in and of itself, right? Like letting yourself like be open to your own emotions and letting it out onto a page. And there's almost this feeling of like you really are putting like a piece of yourself onto the page. And I feel like therapeutically, sometimes it can be good to like take things that you maybe don't like about yourself and like explore that, or like insecurities, or like things that make you uncomfortable. Like, and like really, you can take it not out of yourself, but like you could kind of like look yourself in the eye by like doing these writing exercises. And I guess kind of all of this to say that I think as modern witches, there is like this place, I think, for appreciating poetry. Like, if nothing else, I think that some appreciation should go into the craft that goes into when people are writing their own spells. Like there's some beautiful verse that's out there in other people's spell books. It's like, so I don't know. I just feel like that there's like a level of respect for the craft that I feel like we could strive for, just in and of itself. But also, I would say, again, it's like this act of creation. I think is very much what witches are about, and I really think it's like like bringing this into your craft is just such would be such good synthesis for people who have these kind of like creative tendencies. And it's like you don't have to be on script, you do not have to be on book, you can kind of come up with this stuff yourself. And yeah, maybe it'll be better. And the last thing I will say, the last thing I will say is that pe- people have a better handle of poetry than I think they give themselves credit for. And one example that I am going to throw out is like, do you have like weird little songs and stuff that you sing to your pets? Shannon, I'm asking you.
Oh,
I am asking
all
you
the
this
time.
question. Okay, so it's like
All the time. I it's kind of like a game where Eric and I will take songs that we enjoy, modern songs, and we
sure,
will rewrite them
yeah,
lyrically for Willow.
for Willow. Um, and yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about though, because I do the same thing. I do the exact same thing. And I mean, I write poetry as a hobby and also as part of my craft, but I've heard people that are not into that, like when you're doing something like that, just like come up with amazing stuff off the top of their heads. And I'm not saying like sit down and write some very intense poetry about Persephone and the underworld like right away. Okay, but fuck around with it. Like I think you would find and you would kind of have that level of confidence. Like think about all of the weird little songs you've like written for your pets that are actually good and catchy. Like you have it in you to write good poetry about, again, like I did read some poetry about Persephone in the underworld because I have a Cancer Mars. Okay, I just have to throw that out there every couple of episodes to remind people that I am a soft boy. Okay, and
You've got a soft and gooey center.
I do, but it's like you are better at writing poetry than you know, and I just think that's one example. Like like rewriting lyrics to songs to be about weird stuff. Even like I don't know. So, sometimes we'll just make up weird songs about like lasagna at work and stuff. Like,
Yeah, I mean, writing songs for your pets is really fun. Like we've rewritten Psycho Killer to be
oh yeah,
about Willow. That's a good one. But
yeah.
also like I'll just get going and it is fun because also I'll like give Willow dialogue where sometimes she's like, not your best work, mother. And I'm like, I know. But I think it's also important to remember that like you don't have to be good at it to do it. And eventually, like you'll probably start making stuff you like, but most artists and writers and like anyone who's creative makes a bunch of shit to get the few things that they really like out.
And it's like it's this thing they call composting, right?
Yeah.
Where especially with writing, okay, if you want to write something, and you're gonna throw away most of it.
Yeah.
That's part of it.
It's part
Okay,
of the
honey, it's
process.
part of it. Okay, like go. Okay, it's like you have like $5 on a half price gift card floating around in your wallet somewhere. Go get like 5 of those 98-cent journals at Half Price Books and just write some shit,
Yep.
okay? Literally, that's how you start. But, also, I will end here by saying that if anyone is interested in reading my shitty notes app poetry, feel free to hit me up. Shannon, how could they do that?
You can reach out to us through our Instagram is probably one of the quickest, easiest ways to get a hold of us. That's at Wands and Bronze Pod on Instagram. You can also go old school, send us an email, which is wandsandbronzepod@gmail.com. Carrier pigeons, you're gonna need to email us or message us to get our addresses. And if you want even more, if you want to like talk to us directly, if you want to join our coven meeting, which will have already happened by the time this is posted live, but Monday night, so tomorrow night, there's going to be a small coven meeting for people on our Patreon, which is patreon.com/wands and bronze pod. We're pretty easy to find, y'all. And if you want to support us and you don't necessarily have the cash money to do a Patreon, rate, review, subscribe, honey. It's super easy. You guys know the system. You listen to podcasts. Just do it.
Excellent. And I would say, you guys, on that review, okay, we have come up with a lovely template just to make things that much easier for you. So if you're on Apple Podcasts, for instance, and you wanted to just leave a little review because you love us and we're gorgeous, that's going to be this podcast is good 5 stars.
Yeah. The end. You don't even have to think. Look at you guys. We took
Yeah.
all the thinking out of it for you. You're welcome. And Nick will give you a free one tarot card
Yeah, that's
reading.
right. If you post a review that says this podcast is good 5 stars, I will do a 1 card tarot pull for you. Hit us up on Instagram to redeem this incredible offer. which economists have valued at $100
Oh, conservatively.
conservatively. Yeah, worth $100.
One hundy. All right. Well, let's talk about Ogma. So this is a Celtic deity. So you guys know we're going to be talking about the Tuatha De Danann. So the Tuatha De Danann, remember, it's like basically the story of the gods and goddesses that were born from Dagda and Danu. And one of their children was our dear friend Ogma. And he was said to be the fairest of Danu's sons. And he was born with a talent for poetry and writing. And because of these powers, he came up with a lot of languages and he wrote a ton of poetry, like you do. You know, he was filling up a billion of those like 85-cent notebooks that we were just talking about. He was also said to have had a sunny countenance, like literally rays of sun beaming from his hair. But because of his love of language, he came up with a way for people to write things down, which clearly didn't mean shit to the fucking druids. So perhaps they should have paid a bit more attention. But since he came up with a writing tradition, it was named after him. And this is where we get, you'll hear it Americanized, pronounced Ogham a lot. I know it's technically Ogham. So you'll hear it pronounced both ways, but I don't want to just say Ogham and then assume that you guys know what I'm talking about, because I always hear it pronounced Ogma or Ogham. So Ogham, but it's a fascinating writing system. We see it on inscriptions from the 4th to the 6th centuries AD, and it was used mainly to write Old Irish, but it also was used for Old Welsh, Pictish, and even Latin. And it was based on a high medieval Briarthagum. God, there's so many like words today. Briar Thorogum tradition, where the names of trees were assigned to individual characters. So trees, obviously a big deal to the Gaelic peoples, and this is actually one of the only alphabets that's written and read vertically from bottom to top, you know, like the direction that trees grow. How cool is that? So, like runes, each Ogham symbol has a name. So, for example, the letter B is called Beha or birch. The letter C is Call or hazel, etc., etc. And the 20 letters are called Theta, which means trees. And they're grouped into 4 Ecma families of 5 letters each. And each letter is a cluster of 1 to 5 lines that's usually scratched along like the vertical edge of a stone. So throughout Ireland, Scotland, and Western Britain, i.e., where like my mother's side of the family is from, there are more than 400 surviving Ogham inscriptions on stone monuments. And we know for certain that it was used to write personal names on the edges of standing stones, like memorials, for example, but also potentially as like boundary or border markers. But we have references in Old Irish literature that also talk about Ogham used on sticks to send messages, like post office style, like, you know, scratching out a stick note to someone, passing it along. But they were also used to record information and to do magic. So there's so many other versions other than Ogma that tell us how like Ogham came to be, including there's like a tie-in to the Tower of Babel. But there are some really interesting quirks that like muddy the waters even more when we try to like trace the lineage of it. And in Shetland, they have found Ogham representing Norse words. Like fucking awesome. So in Killaloe, there's actually a stone dedicated to a Scandinavian settler, Torgrim, which is written in Norse runes and then replicated in Ogham. So if you go to ogham.co, there's actually a really cool translator. It's a great tool if you want to incorporate it into your magical practice. But the most common way to use Ogham for magic is in divination, right? So you can find or make staves that have an Ogham symbol on each stave. And I've even seen some folks, and like these sets are amazing, where each stave is made from the wood that the Ogham symbol symbolizes. Um, and so it'll be like Bea would be on a birch stave, and then it would have the character carved into it, which is like fucking epic. But you can also like make staves, right? And if you do this, there's just an Ogham symbol on each stave. There are even some people who do it where each like you can use it on stones like you would on runes. And if you're gonna make your own like OM throwing stones, basically just make sure you're using like a writing implement that doesn't easily rub off. Like it sounds logical, but you guys would be surprised how many like different writing materials pretty quickly fade off of stone. So but the way you do the divination traditionally is to place all your staves in a bag, think about your question, and pick 1 to 5 staves depending on the complexity of the question. And after that, it's like interpretation. But because in OM the characters are represented by trees, one of the ways that the divination works is you use the correspondences that you would associate with the tree when you're interpreting. So, for example, if you drew Bega or Birch, that tree represents new beginnings, change, new ideas. The ash tree, it's about fate, divine processes, spiritual inspiration, taking action. Like, this is a really interesting divinatory tool, but the basic mechanics of it, you're already familiar with through things like tarot. I think it makes sense to work with Agma if you want to get into using Ogham as a divinatory tool. And of course, the offerings to him are pretty straightforward: milk, honey, always good bets, libations. But I also love the idea of writing poetry that you dedicate to Agma. So you could write a poem on a piece of paper and like burn it in a cauldron as an offering. You know, use that, burn a poem that's written about the thing that you're trying to manifest, you know, offer it out to Agma, ask for his assistance. Agma, I think, is also just like clutch if you're a writer in general, or really any type of creative who uses words as a medium. But really, that's all I have. It's like pretty straightforward. I just wanted to like talk a bit about Agma and about Ogham as like a system. So the sources I used today were treesforcities.org, thecottagemystic.com, druidry.org, and of course ogham.co. So, woo!
Love that. Um, just circling back around because I did have this kind of ending prepared for poetry, and then I completely dropped it because I spaced out. This is a morning ones and fronts, everybody, and
Yeah, this might be the earliest we've ever recorded.
Nick is not a morning person, so just bear with me here. But I did kind of want to finish out poetry though by saying that you know, as far as like working with it in your craft, I do feel like poetry very much has like lunar associations. Like the obvious association would be Mercury or like Venus if we're talking love poetry. But for me personally, I feel like the poetry, like the flow, it's like I I definitely feel the moon very acutely, as you know.
Yeah.
Like I'm often up for days at a time around the full moon.
But it's
And
also like the lunar cycles are changing and there's movement
yes.
and cadence. Yeah, I
Yes, yes,
100% see
yes.
that.
I feel like poetry is very lunar. I feel like lunar people, like people with like lunar and mercurial placements are gonna have this like natural proclivity towards poetry.
Yeah.
I feel like lunar people are very moved by poetry.
Oh yeah. I mean, y'all, I am not joking. I was like weeping at this poetry reading. Like I think some people are hit by it more, but I also think that if you're a magical person and you've maybe written off poetry as something for beatniks in black turtlenecks, open up your mind. Come back to it. Don't let the
Come back
stereotypes get
to
in the
it.
way.
Come back to it. Yeah, and that's kind of what I meant about like being like a stuffy academic thing.
Yeah.
Because really, if when you start looking into like modern poetry, like there really is this kind of like pretentious Ivy League kind of slant towards things with poetry. And it's like, honey,
Poetry's for the people.
poetry's for the people. You don't have to go to Harvard to say the word faggot and talk about cigarettes.
Yeah. Also, like, and we're not just like ragging on this, guys. Like, I have my degree is in American studies, but my minor is in English. Like, we're not saying this to say it's bad, and we're not saying it to rag on people, but it's just the truth about what happened. Like,
But it's like to those people, I would say I I've read great modern poetry, and I have read absolutely pretentious gatekeepy modern poetry. And it's like whereas I mean that line's going to be different for everyone, but I would say don't be gatekeepy as a community, as poets, or or it's like don't be intimidated by that, because honestly, like they do not represent the art form, even though they do currently seem to be the custodians of it.
yeah, very good point. Snaps for that.
So all of that to say, but yeah, I feel like moon people are poetry people. So
I agree.
to all the moon witches out there. But okay, well we're very close to the bitter end, which means it's Taroscope time, and it's my week, y'all. And we're living in this space of I'm no longer getting to give good news. Well, I mean, I would say this isn't necessarily bad news, but
It's
here's
a
the thing.
read.
It's a bit of a read. You saw what I wrote, but like
I
I'm not.
did.
Anywho, so this week I drew for my little zodiac deck, and I've got it right here. Libra,
I just love the little kitty holding the scales.
little kitty holding the scales. And for you guys, I drew the Knight of Cups reversed, which is telling me that you guys are sort of like living in a fantasy world. And like here's the thing. Here's the thing. I think sometimes it's very tempting to live in a fantasy world, to perhaps drop everything you own and move across the country, right? But in this situation, reality, in some form or another, has reared its ugly head into your escapist fantasy. And here's what we're saying. Here's what we're saying is that like stuff like that is going to happen. It's not necessarily the healthiest thing to live in a fantasy world. And ultimately it's like really not productive to be mad when like the reality of your situation is setting in. Like, and that's tough love. That's tough love, babies. Like you just have to you got to keep one foot on the ground. Okay? It's like we know, and especially with Libra, I'm like we know that you guys kind of have your heads in the clouds, and that's something that's beautiful even, but one foot on the ground. You got to keep one foot on the
Yeah.
ground, honey.
And it's like, I get it, y'all. I got a Pisces moon. I understand living in the daydream. But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Even my spirit guide turtle has kicked me back to the real world before. So,
Yeah. Yeah, because sometimes you gotta check in. Sometimes you gotta check in
yeah.
with the real world. Um, and that's all I have for you guys. So check in with the real world. Call an Aries or Virgo friend.
Yeah. Or even a Gemini, call your mercurial friends.
Yeah,
Like,
call a Mercurial. Yeah, just call someone who's gonna tell you. Call a
mhm.
call a fucking Capricorn.
Oh my god. I mean, if you wanna cry.
I
Uh
mean
I say as someone who adores Capricorns, but, like, sometimes you need tough love, and sometimes not that tough.
not yeah, well, maybe I'm just like, just to rip off the Band-Aid. Because
That's true.
I'm just like, just get it over with.
That's true. I don't have any strong Cancer placements, but I do acknowledge that my Pisces moon gives me that soft boy edge, where sometimes I'm like, "Ow, no."
Oh no.
Anyway, yeah, I think that's all she wrote.
All right. Well, to all of you poetic bitches,
Oh my god, you sexy poetic bitches. Blessed be bitches.
blessed be you poetic bitches. Bye now.
Goodbye.